So, hi, I'm Manman, and I'm developing a loosely Norse-inspired fantasy Metroidvania, Field of Flowers. As I left off last time, I was still working on translating and remaking pieces of the project from Unity over to Godot. Of course, progress has slowed down steadily the further I've now gotten, as I have less and less work to take directly from Unity over to Godot. Instead, I'm now at the point where I've had to start remaking things instead of simply copy-pasting and touching up, or just plainly having to come up with new things from scratch. Alongside all that, I've continued looking inward to polish and improve my workflows and tools as I continue developing areas of the game. To shove my current state of my progress all into a cliché quote, I'm sharpening the axe. What for exactly? Well, let's put a pin in that for now. One of the things I still had to recreate based on existing code were boss creation tools. I already looked into it and pondered as to how to start creating modular boss scripts back in Unity last year, as mentioned in one of the earlier videos. Just like previously, I have a brain node which controls the base behaviors of a boss using simple states like disabled, idle, default, enraged, and staggered. Depending on the state, it sends specific signals in the update loop, which are in turn wired up to run whatever desired loops in the boss behavior script. This lets me use the same brain component for whatever boss I want, and I don't have to rewrite the same basic framework for every single one. Even though I made a couple quick test bosses in my Unity project, I decided to pretty much scrap the existing work and graphics for now. Instead, I created a completely new set of animations and behaviors based on one of the characters I have, Astrid. Basic idea is, she has ice spells and is an alchemist, and is mostly focused on blunt force. So, I gave her a couple basic attacks, like a kick, an ice slam with a possible combo move, and some throwable potions. The design of the boss and its attacks aren't anything mind-blowing, but compared to my couple previous test bosses, she's a little more versatile and let me test some concepts I will need later on when creating more. Of course, the actual logic behind the specific boss itself isn't that complicated either. All of the attacks are just animations and timers for damage checks, and the backflip is just separate X and Y lerps with a curve applied to them. When she's done with an attack, she goes into the idle state and either just stands still or walks towards the player. After a random period of about 1 to 2 seconds, she then rolls another attack, setting internal states that check which timer needs to be used. That same loop then just runs indefinitely until defeat. Bosses don't really need to be any more complicated than that. I'm considering also rigging the brain, or at least a simple variant of it, to work with all basic enemies instead of just bosses. This way, I can potentially run different behaviors depending on the need more easily. Whether that happens, of course, remains to be seen, but it's a likely possibility at this point for the sake of future-proofing and modularity. And, further speaking of modularity, I also now have a basic framework for creating interactable elements and objects. Bit of a boring topic, of course, but let me give you an example. It would be really easy for me to create a lever and a door and just wire those two together with a direct reference from one to the other. And of course, as I've already mentioned in previous videos, it's exactly what I used to do when starting out. However, if I wanted to then add something else to that lever as well, I'd need to add another reference, and on and on and on ad nauseum. This isn't too difficult of a task to work through, as with signals I can easily create a chain, and then abstract each element of it. Roughly speaking, I have the interactable objects which are linked to a figurative signal box. that signal box then takes all of those different signals and turns them into a single one, which in turn is passed on to whatever object or different element I want. The door itself does not care what the original source is, it just receives the final signal that it was interacted with and acts accordingly. Instead of a lever, the interactable could easily be something like an input prompt, a one-time trigger, or maybe even a line of dialogue. To give another concrete example, the same interaction system is used by interaction-triggered dialogue, entering rest points, and picking up item pickups, just with a key input and trigger combination instead of a lever. Continuing on the topic of tools, I also ended up creating a custom particle spawner and particle objects. I'm not denying that Godot's particle system is fairly robust, but there's a small problem in the fact that 2D collision physics aren't something they support. Thus, they cannot interact with things like ground collision. Sure, I could potentially add light occluders on every surface which they interact with, but that's way too big of a task to do by hand. Besides that, there are some neat and useful behaviors I can give my custom particles that will definitely come in handy later. They might not be the most optimal thing in terms of performance, but they work well enough. I just have to keep in mind to not use them too much. With my custom particles, I can now apply different sprite sets depending on the velocity direction of each particle, as well as wire up things like different particles on ground detection. I also added basic spawn settings like multiple particle types per spawner, launch angle, and spread, the two of which were a bit of a pain considering I utterly failed my vector math course in high school, and now I suddenly had to figure out how to rotate a vector by a specific angle. Which, I'll be honest, was a slightly harder of a task to grasp at first than I originally assumed, and it ended up taking me at least a couple hours to sort out. Of course, the main launch angle itself wasn't the difficult part, but when I suddenly have to learn how matrices work in order to calculate the extra added spread, it becomes a bit more difficult. I've mostly tested the system with quick blood particles I created, but not only can I use it for basic visuals, I also, for example, used them to create Astrid's potion attack. On the topic of the visual side of things, I've spent a bit more time prototyping and testing out how to improve backgrounds for the future. Readability is extremely important, and one of my main gripes with my previous attempts at a background was the fact that it was a little too detailed with too many different color values, as well as just a confusing value ramp. If we, for example, look at a painting that shows an environment, we can see that as things get more distant, they get brighter and have overall less contrast. If I highlight the overall brightness of elements in the old background, it probably becomes somewhat obvious that it's jumping all over. Now, with the new one I made for testing purposes, it has a more natural ramp from one layer to the other, as well as less overall details to make it less noisy, thus far easier to read against the more important foreground elements. In the last video, I also mentioned my new parallax background builder. I ended up realizing that while it's extremely useful, it's also extremely inefficient as it is. If I ever wanted to automatically update the layers with new sprites or different width, there would also potentially be other extra props to account for. I would have to either move the added extra prop layers out of the parent, or have them deleted alongside the main layers. This would potentially lead me to lose a lot of work that I'd have to redo. So, I ended up multiplying the line count of the script by about 3, and as a result, it can now automatically differentiate between extra and main layers. This makes it possible for it to add missing or delete unnecessary main layers, depending on the need, as well as update the sprites and their positions without deleting everything, especially without touching the extra ones made for props. I've also continued messing around with shaders, and with the help of Nolkaloid's shockwave tutorial, I put together a shader for creating a similar effect, starting from a specified point on the screen. Considering I'm still fairly new to working with shaders, I didn't quite figure out a smart way of having multiple waves layered on top of each other. So, for now, it's running 3 independent equations for waves in the same script. With the help of shaders, I was also able to add very basic wavy leaves and other foliage. It definitely does add a nice extra touch of liveliness to a scene. There's of course a fair bit more to talk about for the future, but for now it's hard to go in depth into any of it, so here's a quick rundown of the few other small things I've also messed with. Prototyping 3D models as main menu backgrounds and making an actual main menu work, prototyping different spells and their icons, giving Riot the ability to steal temporary spells from enemies, actually making it possible for Riot to die and hazard damage. Lastly, saving settings. Yes, a very exciting feature to end on. No, wait, I also added bouncy shrooms. Now, I mentioned that I was sharpening the metaphorical axe with all of this further progress. What for? Well, I hope it's fairly obvious that all of these things I've talked about now are all about working more efficiently. It's all about making the next steps, that is, cutting down the metaphorical tree, way easier and faster. My next step for the project is to finally start actually thinking about creating a vertical gameplay slice, and to actually have something to show to people and have it be tested. Thanks to my UX classes that I took last autumn and other courses I've taken as well, I've grown to understand just how important testing and iterating on results is for anything interactable. So, I'm giving myself a bit over a month to hack together a small set of levels like I tried to do back in Unity last summer, but this time with a bit more direction in what I actually want. It should not only give me something to show and test with, but it'll also be a great test to see whether there's still some sort of tool I'm missing from my toolbox of game development hacks, or if some of my current tools are still in a need of being worked on. Whatever the result is, it should be a great experiment.